Good afternoon and welcome to our webinar, Food, Farms, and Faith, a faithful update on the Farm Bill and what you can do about it, presented by the Interreligious Working Group on Domestic Human Needs. We have a pretty packed hour in store for you today, so I'm going to be pretty quick before I hand it over to our presenters. My name is Rachel Banks and I work for the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, and I'll be your moderator today. Before we get started, I just wanted to point out a few logistics. Right now, you're in listen-only mode, but I encourage you to ask questions throughout the webinar so that our presentation can be as interactive as possible. You can do this by typing your questions into the questions section of your GoToMeeting toolbar, and then we'll share them with the presenters. Also, this webinar is being recorded so that you can share it with others afterwards. The Farm Bill is a mammoth piece of legislation that passes through Congress every 5 years. It governs everything from farm subsidies to conservation to insurance to nutrition programs. Our faith traditions are explicit in the command that we feed the hungry and help eradicate hunger from our society. In Isaiah 58:7, God commands us to share our bread with the hungry and bring the homeless into our house. We must fight hunger not individually, but rather by working together as a community. Ferd Hefner will be getting us started today with an overview of the Farm Bill, an update of where we are in the process, and some specifics on farm subsidies, conservation, and the stranded programs. Ferd is the policy director for the National Sustainable Agriculture Coalition, or NSAC, which is the leading voice for sustainable agriculture in the federal policy arena, bringing together the voices of over 90 grassroots farm, food, conservation, and rural organizations from all regions of the country to advocate for federal policies supporting the long-term economic and environmental sustainability of agriculture, natural resources, and rural communities. He's also served as consultant to Bread for the World, the Lutheran Office for Governmental Affairs, Presbyterian Church USA, and the U.S. Catholic Conference. Ferd, take it away.
Thank you very much, Rachel, and it's a pleasure to be with everybody today on this webinar. Let me go right to the slide on what is the Farm Bill. Go ahead to the next one. As Rachel mentioned, it is a very big piece of legislation. It can be in the hundreds, if not thousands, of pages long. It's not the only federal legislation impacting food and farm policy by any stretch of the imagination. There's child nutrition legislation. There's various environmental laws that impact farming, tax policy as well. But it is perhaps the major and unifying piece of policy related to food and farming. It's entirely within the jurisdiction of the House and Senate Agriculture Committees, although every once in a while they add provisions that move beyond their jurisdiction, which is true again this year. But by and large, it's in their jurisdiction. They write the bill. It's been reauthorized every 4 to 7 years. Right now we're on a five-year cycle. Sort of three maybe errors of farm bills from their beginnings in the New Deal in the 1930s through the 1960s, when farm bills came up sporadically, sort of more on an as-needed basis. And then starting in 1970 right on through to today, where they've been on a regular schedule. First every 4 years, and then a slightly longer schedule now, but has pretty much run like a railroad schedule on a well-maintained railroad that happens right on time, which leads us to the third era, which is the one we're in right now, which is confusing at best as to what it will be like in the future, and we'll get to that later. Go ahead to the next slide. Just to reiterate the point about how broad it is, this is just the list of Farm Bill titles from the 2008 Farm Bill. Not every Farm Bill will have exactly the same titles or exactly the same order, but it gives you a pretty good look at the breadth of it, from conservation to nutrition to rural development to organic agriculture and so on and so forth. So it's quite broad. Go ahead to the next one. Where we are now is a state of confusion. So even before my first bullet here, there should be a preceding bullet which says the House and Senate got together on a farm bill actually back in 2011. That didn't come to fruition. Then they tried again in 2012. That didn't come to fruition, and instead they temporarily extended the old farm bill, though they didn't extend everything, which I will also, another big point that I will get to more later. But that extension now runs out this September 30th, so we're only 2 months away from the end of the temporary extension of the 2008 Farm Bill. So this year, Congress took it up all over again, and the Senate passed, on a fairly bipartisan note, passed their bill back beginning of June, and then the House wound up, to everybody's surprise, defeating their version of the Farm Bill just 10 days later. And then after caucusing amongst the majority party, they decided to come back with a farm-only Farm Bill, as they called it, minus the nutrition title, and there'll be a whole lot more in a bit about the nutrition title, so I won't go into detail there. So right now we have a mess. We have a House that's passed half a Farm Bill, is trying to decide what to do with the other half, and no clear path forward as that deadline approaches. So we could be heading towards a new Farm Bill this fall. That's certainly, from speaking for NSAC, that's our hope, but we could also very well be heading to a second Farm Bill extension, and we'll just have to see how that goes. So go to the next slide, and one issue, not that money is the only issue in a Farm Bill, but it's certainly a major one. So just to give everybody a grounding in what kind of money we're talking about, this is over 10 years. Congress does everything based on 10-year windows. So over the course of the next 10 years, those two pieces of the pie that are outside the circle there are the sort of the major farm pieces. The farm subsidies and the farm conservation programs. Together those are about $200 billion over 10 years, so not a small chunk of change. But the great big piece of the overall pie is the nutrition title, and the biggest piece of that is the SNAP program, as we'll get to later in the webinar. So that's just sort of the budget context for discussing Farm Bill. So go on to the next one, and now we'll just sort of delve into what did the Senate do, what did the House do. This particular Farm Bill, unlike the last two added money to the Farm Bill. This Farm Bill is, given the deficit situation, is taking money out of the Farm Bill. So it's very much organized around how much is getting cut and who's getting cut and how are they getting cut. So in the Senate bill, again, which was fairly bipartisan, there is what we consider a very significant, too large hit to farm conservation programs of close to $6 billion over the next 10 years. And then there's the roughly $4 billion coming out of the SNAP program, and the rest of the cut is in the farm subsidy arena. But again, remember that the baseline for that is quite large. So on percentage terms, it's actually a smaller cut than the cut to conservation. Go to the next slide, and you'll be able to compare that one with what the House did. And this is based on the bill that was defeated in the House. So it assumes the defeated SNAP title of roughly $20 billion in cuts, so much, 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 much bigger than what the Senate was proposing on that score, but also bigger on farm conservation and smaller on farm subsidies. Clearly, in our opinion, just in terms of the overall budget, the Senate is the far better bill, though we don't think the Senate bill is any great shakes or something to be celebrated in terms of what it's doing to conservation and SNAP. At least it's more reasonable than what the House has proposed and then defeated and then passed part of. So go to the next one, and I'll get into my three main points. That's all by way of background. The three things I wanted to just quickly run through with you, because I think perhaps out of all the many topics in the Farm Bill on the farm side, these might be the ones that people would be most interested in. So what's happening with farm subsidy reform, what's happening with conservation, and then what's happening with what we call now the stranded programs that were left out of the current Farm Bill extension, and I'll explain that further when we get there. So the first slide here, the next one, is farm subsidy reform, and it's sort of a good news, bad news story. So let me set the context. The farm safety net that has evolved since the Farm Bills of the 1970s have been based largely on commodity programs and to a secondary degree on crop insurance. That has now changed in the last few years with the major attention being on crop insurance and still attention on commodity programs, but not as important as they were several decades ago. When those commodity programs in their modern form were being put into shape, society sort of struck a deal via Congress. They said, okay, we're going to have a safety net for when prices are low and farm income is low, but there will be payment limits such that no one farm can just scarf up large amounts of taxpayer money. There has to be some limits. Secondly, we said, and by the way, if you're going to take the taxpayer money, then there has to be some basic level of conservation that you're willing to do. Why should the taxpayer pay for soil erosion and wetland destruction and bad water quality? So there was a quid pro quo based on conservation. And then lastly, there's been some means testing. If you're very wealthy, the amount of subsidy or the subsidy in its entirety, depending on your situation, disappears. And so those have been part of the system now for decades. The good news in both the House and Senate Farm Bill that we're dealing with right now is that on the commodity side, there is payment limitation reform, actually historic payment limitation reform, the best payment limitation law that we've ever had, assuming that we can get it passed, but it's identical language in the House bill and the Senate bill. It limits payments per year to not more than $50,000 per farm. That actually gets doubled for married farmers, so depending on how you count it, it's either a $50,000 cap or a $100,000 cap. Probably even more important than that is that for the first time ever, the rules are set up such that it limits payments to actual working farmers and not to non-farm investors and other people who are just using farming as an investment strategy. So incredibly important, positive. It was part of the bill coming out of the Senate committee. We only won it on the House floor by way of amendment, but it passed overwhelmingly. So we feel pretty good about that. The problem, and it's sort of a bait and switch problem, is that most of the subsidy money, about 2/3 of it going into the future, will be on the crop insurance subsidy side. And lo and behold, on the crop insurance subsidy side, there are no payment limits, there are no conservation requirements, and there's no means testing. And so we want to equalize the rules regardless of which subsidy somebody is engaged with. The good news there is that the Senate bill does put conservation accountability in for crop insurance and does put at least some means testing in for crop insurance. The House bill, however, has none of those provisions, and neither bill has a payment limit on the crop insurance side. So that's sort of all unfinished business, some of which we hope to take care of in conference if the House and Senate do, in fact, go to conference. So that's a snapshot on subsidy reform, and there may be questions. I know that's kind of dense stuff, but I'll just leave it at that for now and move on to the next slide, where I'm going to try to sort of frame up the conservation title. There are three major types of conservation programs, and then each type has several programs under it. There's working lands programs, which basically means how to help farmers who are producing whatever they produce do so in a way that's environmentally sound. So we call those the working lands conservation programs. Then we have the conservation easement programs. Those are more about taking special types of land, for instance, wetlands or native prairie, or farmland that's threatened by shopping center or housing development, and putting conservation easements on them so that they remain in their high value, more natural state. And so there's a variety of conservation easement programs. And then there's one large land retirement program that takes land out of production and puts it into grass and trees. So those are the types of conservation programs, and here's what the bills do. On the negative side, both bills make big cuts. The House, however, cuts a lot more than the Senate, and therefore, between the two, we greatly prefer the Senate cuts. The House does something else that's very incredibly negative, which is takes one of the working lands conservation programs, the Conservation Stewardship Program, and cuts it far disproportional to all the other things in the title. Conservation Stewardship Program in many respects is the most important of the conservation programs. It has the highest environmental standards and probably delivers the greatest bang for the buck in terms of what the environmental outcomes are relative to what the payment rates are going into it from the government. So they sort of take the brightest and the best program and do significant damage to it. The Senate does cut that program as well, but not nearly as hard as the House does. So that's on the negative side. On a positive note, both bills take the conservation easement programs, consolidate them, and streamline them into a sort of a single umbrella program that captures all of the different kinds of easements and provides permanent funding. Those programs have not had permanent funding in the past, and so that would be a big step forward. There's also targeting provisions in both bills to use all of the different kinds of conservation money to really pinpoint local problems in a sort of focused way, and that's very positive, again, both in the House and Senate bill. But then there's more negative things. One of the big negative things in the conservation title is that sequestration or the automatic budget cuts hit conservation programs very, very hard. And so we desperately need Congress to repeal sequestration, not just for this reason, but for many other reasons, but this is one of them. And then that funny word you see there, chimps, is a fancy Washington term for what the appropriators do when they write annual appropriation or government funding bills to mandatory funding when they need to steal money from mandatory funding like Farm Bill funding and use it for other purposes. And one of the big areas that gets this raid is conservation programs. So we're faced with the situation where you have what the Farm Bill does is only step one. Then there's another bite at the apple called sequestration. Then there's the third bite at the apple known by this unusual term chimps, which means changes in mandatory program spending. And so it's like we're never done defending conservation from cuts. And then last but definitely not least, the House bill. I mentioned at the outset that sometimes one body or the other decides to do things outside of the jurisdiction of the Agriculture Committee, and the House Agriculture Committee has done this in spades this time, and there's damaging provisions to the Clean Water Act, there's damaging provisions to labor law, there's damaging provisions to the Commerce Clause of the Constitution, and I could go on. None of which are in the jurisdiction of the House Agriculture Committee, but the House sort of doesn't play by normal rules anymore, so they've loaded the bill up, including some very damaging environmental riders. None of those riders are in the Senate bill, and hopefully the Senate will insist on taking them out in conference. So that's a quick nutshell on the conservation programs. Go to the next slide, and this is what we now call the stranded programs. We had big wins in sustainable agriculture and food systems in the 2002 Farm Bill, and the 2008 Farm Bill created a whole plethora of new programs that have now gotten off the ground, and USDA has been running, sort of creating Farm Bill funding for other titles besides the nutrition commodity subsidy, crop insurance subsidy, and conservation programs. So this was really a landmark set of wins in 2002 and 2008. And what happened when Congress extended the Farm Bill for this year to give itself more time is it left all of these programs on the cutting room floor. So none of them exist for 2013, and become a huge issue for us to win either in the real Farm Bill, where there's good news about these stranded programs, or in the Farm Bill extension, where there has been really bad news about it. So go to the last slide, and I'll give you just a feel for what these programs are. One way to think about them is it deals with what I call the rest of agriculture beyond the commodity agriculture that is the subject of the commodity title. So beginning farmers, were left out of the Farm Bill extension. Minority farmers or socially disadvantaged farmers were left out of the Farm Bill extension. Farmers markets and local food left out of the Farm Bill extension. Various rural development and rural job creating programs like value-added producer grants and rural micro-enterprise lending, and renewable energy programs like the REAP program, Rural Energy for America program, which is loans and grants to farmers to do both farm conservation and renewable energy based on farm resources. All of those were left out of the Farm Bill extension. Everything related to organic farmers and organic agriculture was left out of the Farm Bill extension, as was some, but not all, of the fruit and vegetable programs. That's a pretty, and not on my list, but high on the list of other organizations, was disaster assistance for livestock farms who got hammered by the drought last year. If you add up new farmers and minority farmers and organic farmers and local food farmers and fruit and vegetable farmers and livestock farmers, you're dealing with way more than half of agriculture, and yet they were totally left by the wayside. The good news is in the Senate Farm Bill, and to a lesser extent in the House Farm Bill, all of these programs created in the last two Farm Bills are renewed for funding if we get the final Farm Bill, the long-term Farm Bill. They all are renewed. Some at really good levels of funding, some were not happy with the level of funding, but at least they would still exist for the next 5 years and they would have some level of funding. Some really good, some mediocre, but all of them would continue. With a Farm Bill extension, however, they were left out this year, they could be left out next year. So what we're urging people to do is to communicate with Congress that, you know, these programs should be funded in the new Farm Bill, and should the new Farm Bill not happen and we go to a Farm Bill extension, they have to be funded in the Farm Bill extension. So that's a really make or break issue for us. And my last slide is just how to get a hold of us. So our website is sustainableagriculture.net, lots of Farm Bill information there. And there's my name and contact information, anybody that wants to get a hold of me. So that's mine, and I think we're going to hold questions to the end probably, so I'll just turn it back to Rachel.
Sure, thanks, Ferd. I learned a lot. Now we're going to hear from Christine Ashley, who will be filling us in on the latest in nutrition. Christine, a policy analyst, joined Bread for the World in 2009. Bread for the World is a collective Christian voice urging our nation's decision makers to end hunger at home and abroad. And Christine provides organizational leadership on nutrition assistance and child nutrition issues affecting hungry and poor people in the U.S. by developing and implementing policy and legislative strategies. Thanks for joining us, Christine.
Thanks, Rachel. It's great to be here with everyone and talking about the Farm Bill. First, that was a great overview of where we are on, generally speaking, on the Farm Bill, and I really just wanted to take some time to go through the nutrition program because I know this is something that's been getting a lot of press and is really important and near and dear to our hearts here in the faith community. So like Ferd mentioned, the nutrition title is by far the biggest part of the Farm Bill, and I just wanted to give you an idea. I know a lot of times when we talk about nutrition, we use it in the Farm Bill, we use that interchangeably with the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, or formerly known as food stamps. But this here is just a short list of all of the programs that are included in the nutrition title of the Farm Bill. SNAP is by far the largest, but we also, there's policy changes to TFAP, the Commodity Supplemental Food Program, which gets food boxes to seniors. TFAP, of course, helps food banks put food on the shelves. There's seniors farmers markets programs, food distribution on Indian reservations, community food projects, hunger-free communities grants, and a number of other small programs that are all found in the nutrition title. And most of these, this Farm Bill cycle, with the exception of SNAP, has seen some positive changes or no policy changes. But SNAP in particular is our primary concern moving forward because, as Ferd said, it is the largest part of Farm Bill spending and therefore has a huge target for cuts. So a little bit about SNAP, because that's really what we're going to focus on here, is, like I said, the largest part of the Farm Bill pie. It serves 47 million people. Over 75% of participants are children, elderly, or disabled. So this program is definitely reaching the people it's supposed to be reaching, the most vulnerable in our society. And it's an effective and efficient program. You know, we've seen poverty remain high. We've seen unemployment and underemployment remain high over the last several years. But food insecurity, that measure of how many people in our country are struggling to put food on the table, has really remained stable over the last 3 or 4 years, since 2008, which we think really has a lot to do with the fact that we have a strong safety net in place. Yes, people are also visiting their food banks more often and they're getting assistance elsewhere, but we have seen the food stamp participation or SNAP participation increase greatly over the last several years, and we think that that has had something to do with these food insecurity numbers remaining level. So, you know, we're really concerned about the Farm Bill, particularly because we believe that any kind of cuts to the program will increase hunger. You know, about 95% of all spending on SNAP goes directly to recipients to buy food. And when that much of your funding is actually going to help put food on the table, any kind of cuts will likely have an impact on families' abilities to buy groceries. So what happened in the Farm Bill? You know, as Bert said, the Senate passed a bill, the House tried to pass a bill, and this is just a snapshot of what they did. So in the Senate bill, the SNAP program was cut by about $4.1 billion. Overall, the nutrition title had only about $3.9 billion in savings, and the difference is that some of the money cut from SNAP was reinvested in other nutrition programs. But the Senate Farm Bill cut would have led to about 450,000 families losing about $90 a month. So they made a change in policy that would affect households that have particularly high heating and cooling costs, and because of the changes in policy, about 450,000 families would see their benefits reduced, which is not an insignificant amount of money when you're trying to buy groceries for your family. So even though that was pretty bad, the House version of the Farm Bill, the one that they were unable to pass back in June, which is what we're basing this analysis on, they cut $20.5 billion from SNAP. Because of the changes, policy changes that they made in their bill, we would have had for 800,000 families losing about $90 a month, so the cut there was a lot deeper than the Senate side. Because of changes made to states' ability to target the program to those most vulnerable in their state, about 2 million people we think would be cut off the program completely. And because of people losing SNAP benefits, you know, it has the unintended consequence of also affecting families with children who are receiving free school meals. And, you know, when you're on SNAP, you have a demonstrated need, and therefore your children are eligible for free school meals. If you lose your SNAP benefits, we estimate that about 210,000 children would lose access to those school meals. So this would have a real impact on families. We think it would definitely lead to an increase in hunger, and we've been pushing really hard against these kinds of cuts in the Farm Bill. But like Bert said, the House wasn't able to pass their bill. They've actually just passed a Farm Bill that has only farm programs and no nutrition title. So what's next for the nutrition title in particular? And, you know, we have heard a lot of different rumors about what's expected, and I have question marks next to every single one of these because it's really, you know, it's really been hard to tell which direction Congress is really going to take. The first thing I have here is a nutrition-only bill. The House voted on a farm bill, and now they want to vote on just what they're calling a food stamp bill. But they've been unable to come to agreement on what that bill could look like. And I think there's a huge debate right now. You know, they didn't think $20 billion was enough of a cut to SNAP. And so the question is, how deep of a cut do they need to be able to get their caucus on board? We've heard rumors that, you know, it could be as much as $130-some billion cut, which if you were following the budget debates back in the spring, you'll know that the House budget actually proposed block granting SNAP and giving the money, just a lump sum of money to each of the states and letting them run their own programs, which would have saved about $135 billion, but would have been a really drastic policy change that we think would have really negative consequences in terms of how many people are able to access the program. So, Congress leaves after this week for 5 weeks. They'll be back home for August recess, and they were not able to do a nutrition-only bill. That might still be a possibility when they come back into town in September, but we'll really have to wait and see how they decide to move forward. The second piece is a question of whether or not they'll move to conference committee. So, if you know your legislative process, a bill has to be passed by the House, another one by the Senate, and then they have to come to an agreement in what's called a conference committee. The Senate is like Ferd said, they're wanting to move forward with conference. The House, wants to pass a nutrition bill if possible, but there's some in the House that are pushing to just move to conference and without a nutrition title, and just base the conference negotiations on what's in the Senate. So that's another possibility. We could end up with an extension of current law, like Ferd said, but that really raises the question of, well, what happens to these programs that don't have any funding to move forward? And I think the fourth thing I have on this list is really concerning to us is that if we wait until after September and the Farm Bill expires, there's a number of other things happening in Congress this fall, from keeping the government funded past September 30th to raising the debt ceiling, which we expect to hit the debt ceiling sometime in November or later this fall. And it could be that these farm programs, because the Farm Bill has such significant savings in mandatory programs, they could be used as a bargaining chip in budget negotiations. And so we're really concerned that, trying to replace this sequester, if Congress decides to do that they could look to farm programs for savings, which we would urge them not to look there because SNAP is currently protected in those across-the-board cuts. So, there's just a looming threat that is really, we're not sure how they're going to move forward, but, we continue to push for them to protect these programs that are so important and that we care about. And my last bullet point is just 2 question marks, because I feel like as many scenarios as I can come up with, Congress will always find another way to shock us and do something else. So, we're really just keeping vigilantly watching and making sure that the programs that we care about are protected regardless of how Congress decides to move forward on all of these issues. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Rachel to introduce our next speaker to talk a little bit more about what we can do about all of this.
Sure. Thanks, Christine, for getting us as confused as Congress is. Josh Curtis is our final speaker today, and like Christine said, he'll share ideas and strategies for field actions in August. Josh is the Director of Government Affairs for Mazon, a Jewish Response to Hunger, which is a national nonprofit organization working to end hunger among people of all states and backgrounds in the U.S. and Israel. Josh implements Mazon's advocacy efforts, including promoting Mazon's legislative and political priorities with Congress and the administration, and growing Mazon's presence with its many national partners, coalitions, and fellow advocates. Thanks for joining us, Josh.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks so much to everybody who's on the call. Ferd used the analogy earlier about the historic process for farm bills being on regular schedule, like trains coming to the station. Well, for this year, it feels like it's a train wreck. And what we need to do in this context with this train wreck is make noise. So I want to share a couple of ideas, particularly oriented toward the faith community, about ways during this really important opportunity around the August recess. So first and foremost, reach out now to your member of Congress's office and try and schedule a meeting with your member. One of the most powerful things you can do, if possible, is to arrange a site visit. Get your member to come to a local food pantry or social service agency to see firsthand some of the programs that would be impacted, and more importantly, to see the personal stories and hear the personal stories of individuals in your community who'd be impacted by the cuts that are on the table. There are also opportunities to try and meet your member where they may be attending a public event. So this is the time of the year where there are many county fairs. Make a plan to go to the county fair when you know your member is going to be there. Ask questions about the Farm Bill and about raise concerns about the impact to hungry people in your community. There's a new resource that I just heard about in the last couple of days created by Americans United for Change that tracks the public events for members of Congress. I believe it's just Republican members at this point, but there may be resources for all members coming soon. So if you log onto the website, it's www.accountablecongress.com. It's a way you can search by state and find activities and events that your member of Congress is planning to attend, including town halls during the August recess. Plan an education session with your member and staff, which is very important as well, to help him or her understand the challenges of hunger in your district and those who'd be impacted by cuts. And if you're able to schedule one of these site visits or education sessions or meetings, reach out to a diverse group of partners to be part of that meeting so they're hearing different kinds of voices from different parts of the faith community to business interests to social service providers to farmers and ranchers. It's important that they hear from a diverse cast of characters. The nutrition title and all parts of the Farm Bill are important to so many different parts of the community, and to the degree that you can bring a complex group to the table, that's helpful. And during these meetings, I want to strongly encourage to highlight personal stories of people in your community who are struggling with hunger. If you're able to bring to a meeting somebody who's benefited from nutrition programs, who could highlight what those mean to them and the impacts that they would feel if there were cuts made, that is incredibly important. Many members of Congress hold town hall meetings during the August recess. This is a great way to raise the issue of hunger in your community and concerns about impacts from proposed cuts. Bread for the World is coming out soon with a resource that will be helpful for town hall meetings, and that's something that we can share later. Again, the accountablecongress.com site is a way also that identifies town hall meetings that are happening in your district. And many of you will remember in 2010 the upswing of the Tea Party movement and the uproar that was felt at town hall meetings. We really have an opportunity and a need to get our voices heard loudly during this August recess as well. Another suggestion is to actively use the media to get our stories out there. Write an op-ed piece or a letter to the editor to highlight the important assistance provided in your community by SNAP and the concerns about the impacts from massive cuts. And if you're able to incorporate personal stories from people in your community, that's always great. And if you have a small staff at your organization, you don't have to do this by yourself. Reach out to national partners who can help with template materials. Reach out to any of us who are facilitating this call, and we can help with resources on those as well. For the faith community in particular, host a prayer vigil to focus on the moral obligation to care for the most vulnerable. Share how our sacred texts inform our collective responsibility to care for the most vulnerable, and that government is a vital expression of that responsibility. There's been an interesting phenomenon in the House Agriculture Committee hearings about the Farm Bill where Scripture was cited on both sides of the SNAP issue, and it's important for us to really reclaim our sacred texts and to talk about the moral issue of taking care of the most vulnerable and how government is a critical piece of the equation. In doing a prayer vigil, consider doing it in an interfaith capacity, and again, inviting diverse participants. And also think about prominent opportunities that are coming up here soon to highlight the importance of the SNAP program. So for the Jewish community, the High Holy Days are coming up in early September. For the Muslim community, the end of Ramadan, the Eid al-Fitr feast is another opportunity to prominently raise attention to this issue. And for the efforts that you're doing in your local community, please make sure to let your national partners and national organizations that you're part of know what you're doing so that we can help in coordinating and connecting efforts with others who might be working in your community as well. So again, want to encourage you, make a lot of noise. Use our righteous indignation to hold our representatives accountable. It's outrageous what they're proposing to do. What we've seen, as Christine mentioned, in the House is really devastating. And I guarantee you members of Congress are going to be hearing about lots of other issues. They're going to be hearing about lots of other concerns with the Farm Bill. If we don't raise our voices up and make sure that they hear our concerns about cutting the nutrition title, they're going to feel like they can make those cuts without any consequences. So we want to make sure that they know we're paying attention and hold them accountable. And thanks for everything that you're doing in the field. There's a lot of important work to do ahead in August, and looking forward to working with all of you on it.
Thanks, Josh. We've had a couple questions coming in. If you have more, feel free to type them in your question box, but we'll get started right off with the same question from a couple of people. What do we do if we're in the wonderful situation where our delegation to Congress is already supportive of SNAP and the Farm Bill? What does our organization do in that advocacy situation?
So that's a great situation to be in, and it's a good question about what to do. I think it's still important to reach out to your member and thank them for the strong positions that they've taken. I wouldn't take it for granted that they're going to necessarily champion continue to be as strong. And so it's important to reinforce the support that they've shown, thank them, encourage them to continue to be strong, get a sense about where they are and what they're hearing, and see if potentially they could stand up to take on a more active leadership role, particularly in the House, so that there are voices other than the wonderful champions that we've heard from, Representatives McGovern and DeLauro, and Fudge. It's important to hear from other leaders, and to the degree that we can get others championing these causes, that's very important. Christine, any other thoughts?
Yeah, no, I'll chime in, and I'll echo what Josh said about definitely thanking your members. And I think the other part is to encourage them to reach out to those members who might be on the fence, or who might not be as supportive, who might have a more influential role in the Farm Bill process. At the end of the day, it's going to come down to those few people who are in the room negotiating the final, back and forth of what's going to be in the bill. And we want to make sure that our champions' voices and opinions have been heard by the members who are going to be in that final negotiation.
Thanks, guys. Our next question, I think, is for Ferd. Jean is curious if any organizations in food and agriculture are considering transitioning advocacy efforts to build off of the changes and the opportunities that appear to be on the horizon in light of the Affordable Care Act.
Oh, interesting question. I'm not sure, to make a transition, but to add it to the agenda. For sure, in the preventative care arena, one of the more interesting things that has started to happen now in different states and with different hospitals around the country are the fruit and vegetable prescriptions that are now being written to help patients access fresh fruits and vegetables at farmers markets, many of which now are right on site at hospitals. Which was an activity that sort of grew out of the Affordable Care Act, and I'm sure there'll be other innovative ideas like that come down the road. One, we often get asked by our members when they get Farm Bill fatigue, which is definitely where we're at right now. 3 years into this process is, when do we just give up on the Farm Bill? And my answer to that is we can't, because that's where the money is. It's like, the bank robber robs the bank because that's where the money is. And if you move to a completely different arena, you have to make really sure that there's going to be funding available, because otherwise you could spin a lot of wheels and not get very far. So that is why one of the many reasons we stay engaged. All of the programs that we've created in conservation over the years, and you saw in the pie chart, it's now quite a big chunk of money, as big as the commodity subsidies, not including crop insurance, but it's big. And then all of the funding for the stranded programs, as I've named them now, all of that money has come from existing Farm Bill money, primarily from the commodity title of the Farm Bill. So we've gotten pretty good at robbing the bank, and we want to stay hitched to it so that we can really grow these alternative agricultural and food system programs that are doing so much good to create jobs and create healthier communities. So that's why we stay there, but we certainly do add things to the agenda, including looking at some of the opportunities like these fruit and vegetable prescriptions under the Affordable Care Act.
Thanks. Our next question from Louise is, what happens to SNAP if there's no Farm Bill extension by September 30th?
That's a great question, and one we get a lot. The interesting thing about SNAP is that if the Farm Bill expires on September 30th, benefits will continue to be paid out. SNAP is kind of a unique program in that it's authorized by the Farm Bill. That's where all the, how the program works is all kind of laid out by the Farm Bill. But in terms of where the money comes from, it's through the appropriations process. So as long as the government is funded and that the program continues to pay out its benefits. So, but that's not the case for a lot of the other programs, and why, particularly the programs that Ferd talked about really do need a Farm Bill to continue.
Although just to add on that, while funding would continue for the SNAP program, there still are great concerns about its vulnerability to other cuts. So as Christy mentioned in her presentation, possibility about cuts that might happen in a budget deal or a negotiation about the debt ceiling or in the appropriations process. So we feel a lot more comfortable with a 5-year reauthorization with no cuts to SNAP. If there isn't a Farm Bill, the funding will continue, but there still are vulnerabilities that we're concerned about.
And this is Ferd. If I could just add to that, too, if the Farm Bill expires, as it almost certainly will, at least for some period of time on October 1st, I don't think under any scenario is anything going to be done by October 1st. So unfortunately, from our point of view, the Senate leadership has made it clear they're not interested in doing a Farm Bill extension in the short term. We'll see about the long term. There are programs that do just completely expire then on October 1st and cease to exist until there is a Farm Bill extension. And that would include things in the nutrition title like the Senior Farmers Market Nutrition Program. It expired last October 1st for 3 months while they fooled around with finally getting to a Farm Bill extension on January 1st. But it includes, huge major conservation programs like the Conservation Reserve Program. It would just cease to exist in terms of any new enrollments on October 1st, and I could go through the whole litany. So there are real consequences to not having a Farm Bill short-term extension, but there almost certainly won't be a Farm Bill short-term extension. Hopefully, if we don't get the full 5-year Farm Bill, which is what we want, there'll be a long-term extension. But there'll be a period of time, that could be a month, it could be several months, where programs go belly up, and that includes a few things in the nutrition title.
Thanks. Our next question is from Billy, who asks, are there any good resources for introducing this issue to young people? The short answer is yes.
Absolutely. I know that Bread for the World has developed resources particularly to use in Sunday school classes, and those are all available on our website at www.bread.org. I know we have different materials for younger kids as well as older kids, and definitely encourage you to check out our website and find those there.
And likewise, Mazone has materials targeting younger audiences. So if you go to mazone.org, there are materials there, and I can also get you connected with our youth outreach coordinator. One thing that's been particularly effective are having youth groups in Sunday school classes do paper plate campaigns to the member of Congress with personal messages and in sharing stories from the local community. And I forgot to mention 2 of the slides at the end of the presentation were just examples of images and stories that Mazone has collected as part of our new Face of Hunger, and it's been a way just to elevate the personal stories and to get past some of the myths and statistics that continue to get perpetuated, and to really bring the issue of hunger back home at a community and personal level.
Great. Kind of the opposite of an earlier question from Amy. We're in a very religious area, and most of our representatives and senators are Tea Partiers and downright hostile to SNAP, even though their community has many recipients. What do you do when the community culture is so hostile, even though you know they need and use the program?
It's a really great question, and a tough spot to be in, right? Because a lot of folks who are Tea Partiers do tend to be religious, and you would think that that would mean they would understand. And unfortunately, they do tend to be targeting these programs more than your average member of Congress. I think an important thing to talk about is, a lot of these members believe that the church should be where this is happening, or the church should be feeding people, or the religious community should be taking care of its people that need help. And while that's, I think it's important to remind our members of Congress that the religious community, we're already doing that. We're already feeding as many people as we can, and so are food banks, so is the Charitable Food Network. And unfortunately, we can't meet all of the needs. Bread for the World did an analysis last year of all the cuts that were proposed to SNAP in the House. And when we did the math, we showed that if you were to take all of the SNAP cuts from last year and divide them up between every religious congregation in the United States, each church would have to come up with $50,000 a year for the next 10 years just in feeding people. Average weekly attendance is about 100 people per congregation. So that's just something that churches can't really take on, and I think that it's important to remind these members that there's got to be some kind of partnership, that churches and charities can't do this all on their own, and that SNAP is important. The second piece is that SNAP participation is set to go down, and I think a lot of folks worry that this is a long-term dependency issue, and I think we need to be very clear that SNAP is a temporary program, and that folks who go on it are usually off within 9 or 10 months and move on to employment or are able to feed themselves afterwards.
And just one quick thing, in conservative districts, I think the faith community has a special opportunity to raise its voice. So reach out to other faith community partners and really bring the moral authority to this issue. I think it's a way to get the attention of more conservative members of Congress and let them know, as Christine said, that the religious community and the charitable sector can't do this alone, and that there's a religious concern about taking care of the most vulnerable. I think that's a voice that might stand out differently.
And we actually, Bread for the World does have a fact sheet on churches and hunger that talks about that $50,000 figure, which is also available on our website, bread.org. And usually the best way to find stuff on our website is to use the search feature up top. And if you search for churches and hunger, you should be able to find that link.
Great. We have a question from Elizabeth asking if we know of any resources for empowering and involving food program guests in the work of advocacy.
So one thing I think is finding opportunities for them to personally share their story. There's been an effort to record videos of recipients of food assistance programs and to feature those prominently. But if you're organizing in-district meetings or visits, make sure and reach out to your service providers and see about getting folks who are beneficiaries of those services to be able to share their personal story. I think it's so important that we talk about this issue not just in terms of the numbers, but in terms of the personal impacts, the struggles, and what cuts would mean at a very personal level.
Okay, and our final question is from Pamela. What are the plans for TSAP, which is a critical part of food bank food streams and is not protected?
So that's definitely an important question. I know that TSAP is usually funded through the appropriations process, and it was kind of one of the bright spots in the Farm Bill in that there was additional money for TSAP in each of the Farm Bills. That's another one of those programs that we continue as we're advocating for SNAP. We're advocating not just for no cuts to SNAP, but for a strong, robust nutrition title. And so that is definitely part of our advocacy here in DC. And I know that a lot of folks, that is a program that's really important, particularly to food banks, and that they're doing a lot of advocacy around that program as well.
Well, I want to thank our 3 speakers for joining us today and sharing their expertise. I hope you will all take all of this great information from the webinar and share it with your communities, colleagues, friends, media. I see that over half of you answered the poll saying that you're planning on writing a letter to the editor or an op-ed, which is wonderful. Go ahead and do that. And please feel free to reach out to any of us or our organizations if you need more information. We will be sending out an email soon with information on how to access this recording and the PowerPoint slides. So if you've missed anything, we've got you covered. Thank you for joining us today. Have a great rest of your afternoon.